The letter was folded into quarters and tucked beneath the lining of Cecily Marsh's left glove, and she could feel it there the way one feels a splinter in the heel. Not painful exactly, but present with every step, insisting on itself through the wool and the careful pretense of a morning she had not been meant to attend. Mrs. Prewitt's drawing room was warm and well attended. 6 or 7 women occupied its pale green chairs, their gowns a saturated arrangement of rose and gold and dove-gray silk. Their conversation arranged around the season's latest engagements and the notable absence of Lord Fenwick from the Hartley ball. Cecily wore her second-best morning dress, a pale lavender wool she had turned once at the collar and would need to turn again before autumn. She had been invited as a courtesy, a gesture on Mrs. Prewitt's part toward a young woman whose situation had recently become precarious, and she accepted that gift without embarrassment because Mrs. Prewitt gave it without condescension, which was rarer than diamonds in London in the second week of March. She had been in the room perhaps 20 minutes, accepting tea she did not quite want, when the door opened. He did not announce himself. He rarely did, from what she had heard. The Duke of Warfield came in from the hall with the particular stillness of a man who occupies whatever room he enters without requiring it to acknowledge him first, and Cecily felt the quality of the room shift before she had fully turned her head. The conversation did not stop precisely. It arranged itself differently. Fans lowered half an inch. 3 separate women adjusted their posture in their chairs. Mrs. Prewitt rose with an expression of genuine pleasure and an outstretched hand, and the Duke accepted it with a brief civil nod and the words, "Forgive the hour. I wanted to speak with you before calling time." He was taller than she had expected. She had seen him once at a distance, at a public occasion 6 months past, and distance had not conveyed the particular economy of the way he held himself, as though motion was a resource he did not spend unnecessarily. His coat was the dark blue of deep water, his cravat white and precisely tied, his jaw set with a tension the room had collectively decided to call composure. His eyes were dark gray and moved in a single controlled sweep across the company before settling on Mrs. Prewitt with deliberate courtesy. They settled on Cecily for less than 2 seconds. She felt it, though. She felt it in the place beneath her collarbone where the letter had no business reaching. "His Grace," Mrs. Prewitt was saying pleasantly, "you will know most of our little company. And this is Miss Marsh, who was so good as to serve as companion to the late Duchess for the better part of 3 years." The Duke said, "Miss Marsh," in a voice that was level and utterly without expression. Cecily said, "Your Grace," and kept her hand still in her lap, the left one tucked slightly beneath the right. He did not look at her again for the remainder of the visit. He had looked once. And it had not been nothing. She knew that much, even if she could not yet afford to know anything else. 3 weeks had passed since Cecily had found the letter, and in 3 weeks she had told no one. She had been at Warfield House in Grosvenor Square for the better part of the winter, completing the final accounting of the late Duchess's personal effects under the supervision of Mr. Ashworth, who was the Duchess's half-brother, and who had arrived within a fortnight of his sister's death with the specific energy of a man who expected to profit from a circumstance that had not yet yielded all it held. The Duchess of Warfield had died in November, quietly, of a fever that took her in 4 days and left the household in a suspended state of grief and paperwork that Cecily had been asked to manage because she was the only one who knew where anything was kept. She had known the Duchess for 3 years. She had liked her, in the careful, restrained way that a companion learns to like the woman she serves, with genuine warmth, and the understanding that liking is not equality, and that equality was not on offer. The Duchess had been handsome and clever, and deeply, quietly unhappy, in a way that Cecily had eventually understood as the particular unhappiness of a woman who had made a choice she could not unmake. She had not confided in Cecily. She had, in the last weeks of her life, begun to leave things in Cecily's path. A small leather case on the writing table. A sealed letter in the correspondence box with no direction on the outside. The case held 2 items. The first was a marriage record from a registry office in Bristol, dated 17 years prior, in the name of Helena Ashworth and a man named Robert Fenn. The second was a letter in Helena Ashworth's hand, addressed to no one and to everyone, which confessed that she had been secretly and legally wed to Robert Fenn before she ever accepted Dominic Cavendish's proposal, and that Robert Fenn had not died until 4 months after her marriage to the Duke of Warfield. She had been a bigamist. The Duke of Warfield, who had believed himself her husband for 12 years, had never been any such thing. The marriage was void. It had always been void. Cecily had sat with this knowledge for 3 weeks, and in 3 weeks had not burned the letter, had not given it to Ashworth, and had not gone to the Duke. She had instead placed it inside the lining of her glove and brought it with her each morning, like a small piece of unfinished business she could not set down. If you have ever held a truth that belonged to someone else and could not find the right hand to put it in, you will understand her. The letter was not hers to keep, and not hers to give without understanding what the giving would cost. She was still weighing it, quietly, in the lavender wool, when she became aware that the Duke's morning call to Mrs. Prewitt had not been purely social. He came to find her. She understood this on the 3rd day, when she encountered him at the lending library on New Bond Street, and he was waiting in the alcove where the periodicals were shelved as though he had come for no other reason, which was impossible because the Duke of Warfield did not browse periodicals in lending libraries. He was standing with his back to the aisle, a copy of something open in his hands, and he did not look up when she entered the alcove. But she understood at once that he had heard her, because the particular quality of his stillness shifted slightly, in the way that stillness shifts when the thing it has been waiting for arrives. He said, without turning, "Miss Marsh, a word, if you please." She said, "Of course, Your Grace." And they stood among the shelves with 3 feet of propriety between them, while a footman lurked in the next aisle, and a clerk pretended to be occupied with the returns ledger. The library was full of the soft sounds of a morning in progress, the shuffle of pages, a low conversation near the window, the fire in the reading room catching a damp log and releasing a brief hiss, and these sounds made the space between them feel smaller than it was. "I am told," the Duke said, his voice low enough that it did not carry, "that when you completed the inventory of the Duchess's effects, there were certain personal papers set aside separately, that they were not included in the boxes delivered to Ashworth." He had turned to face her now. His face was entirely still. She had expected something. Anger, suspicion, the cool social instruments of rank deployed to remind a lesser person of their position. There was nothing of that kind. There was only the gray of his eyes in the pale winter light from the high windows, and a quality of restraint that she recognized with a jolt of sensation below her collarbone as something very close to grief. She was aware of him as a physical fact in a way that complicated the conversation. He was a large man, and the alcove was not especially wide, and when he half-turned to replace the periodical on its shelf, the sleeve of his coat was close enough that she could see the precise stitching at the cuff. She kept her hands still at her sides, which required more effort than she expected. "There were some papers," she said carefully. "The Duchess placed them in my care before she died. I am not certain they were intended for Mr. Ashworth." A pause. Something moved across his face and was contained before it fully arrived. He said, How certain are you that they were not? She considered the question honestly. Quite certain. She left them in a case on her writing table, addressed to no one. In 2 weeks of daily work alongside Mr. Ashworth, she had every opportunity to direct them to him, if she had wished to. And yet she did not. No. The fire in the next room settled, and outside someone was descending the front steps of the library with a great deal of noise. Cecily watched the Duke's jaw and the slight tension there, the working of a man choosing his words with the same care she was choosing hers. "Are they in your keeping now?" he asked. "Yes." "I should like to see them." Cecily looked at him for a moment, and in that moment a decision she had not known was already made became clear to her. Not surrender. She was not surrendering the letter to rank or to command. She had been waiting for the right hand to place it in, and she was standing in front of a man who had, as far as she could tell, been wronged by the very paper he was asking to see. There was something owed in that, if not exactly a debt, then at least a rightness she had been looking for since November. "I do not doubt it, Your Grace," she said. "But I think you will agree that a lending library is not the appropriate place for such a conversation." She paused. "I am staying with Mrs. Prowett in Clarges Street. If you wish to call tomorrow morning, I will ensure the papers are available." He held her gaze. She held his, and was careful to let it cost her nothing visible. "Tomorrow," he said at last. At 11. He left. The footman in the next aisle withdrew. Cecily stood alone among the shelves for a long, measured breath, and then she took down a copy of the Morning Chronicle and opened it, and stood looking at it for a considerable time without reading a single word. Her pulse quieter now, but not quite quiet. Her left glove warm against her hand. It was on the way back to Clarges Street, in the narrow lane behind the market stalls, that she saw Mr. Ashworth and the housemaid. The girl was perhaps 16, with red-rimmed eyes and her cap pushed sideways, and Ashworth was standing over her in the lane with the particular posture of a man who has obtained what he wanted and is now calculating whether there is more. He had taken her wages. Cecily understood this as she rounded the corner, understood it from the expression on the girl's face and the purse in Ashworth's hand, the same purse she had seen the Duchess give to the kitchen staff at Christmas. A small thing, to a man of Ashworth's means, a very large thing to a girl of 16 in a lane in March. She did not think particularly. She walked directly toward them and said, "Excuse me," in a tone that she had learned from 3 years of watching the Duchess speak to people who assumed they could proceed without consequence. Ashworth looked up with the expression of a man interrupted by weather. Cecily said, "That purse belongs to this young woman. I will take it, please." Ashworth's face shifted through several arrangements. He said, "Miss Marsh, this is none of your affair." And she said, "I was present when the Duchess gave that purse at Christmas, and it was given to the staff, not to you. I would be grateful if you would hand it to me." The pause was long. Cecily waded through it without moving. Ashworth put the purse in her hand. She gave it to the girl, who curtsied with wet eyes and fled. Ashworth left without another word, but the look he gave her as he turned was one she noted and filed carefully, because it was the look of a man who would not forget. She did not know, until she was nearly back at Clarges Street, that anyone else had been in the lane. The Duke of Warfield had come that way from the library, following a route different from his carriage. She learned this later, not from him, but from the timing of things, from the way he knew to tell his solicitor, when the moment came, exactly what kind of woman he was speaking of. He had stood in the lane mouth and watched, and said nothing, and walked away. The call at 11 the following morning was not brief, and it was not at all what Cecily had prepared herself to endure. She had expected a duke. She had prepared for one, for the cold authority of rank used as a lever, for the assumption that a companion's reduced circumstances made her compliance a foregone conclusion, for the particular quality of impatience that men of standing deploy when the thing they want is being held by someone who has no obvious reason to hold it. She had practiced in the small spare room above Mrs. Prewitt's kitchen, with the window fogged over from the cold outside, the words with which she would decline to be compelled. What arrived at 11 was a man. He came in through Mrs. Prewitt's parlor door with his hat in one hand and no footman, which she had not expected, and when Mrs. Prewitt herself admitted him and offered refreshment, he said, "Thank you. No?" in a way that was not rude and not warm, but was simply the voice of a man who had come with his attention already committed. Mrs. Prewitt withdrew with the particular tactfulness of a woman who understands when a room requires emptying. He sat in the chair she indicated and did not settle into it in the posture of a man arranging a negotiation. He sat as he stood, with that careful containment, as though the body's stillness cost him something, and he paid it without complaint. The morning light came through Mrs. Prewitt's net curtains in thin white bars and fell across his coat and the side of his face, and the precise set of his hands on his knees. He was close enough that she was aware of him, the way one is aware of a fire in a room that does not yet show its warmth, the awareness preceding the reason for it. The body knowing before the mind has given permission. She placed the letter on the table between them and waited. He looked at it. He did not immediately reach for it. "You read it?" he said. "I did." "And kept it?" "I did not know what to do with it," she said. "Mr. Ashworth has been attempting to locate it for several weeks. I watched him go through the correspondence boxes twice and remove things that had no bearing on the estate. I was not willing to give it to him." Something moved across his face at Ashworth's name, a controlled tightening. "No," he said. "I imagine not." He took the letter. He held it for a moment without opening it, as a man holds a document he has already half understood. And then he unfolded it and read it. And the reading took longer than the words required because he read it twice. Cecily looked at the grate and listened to the fire, a small ordinary fire in Mrs. Prewitt's modest hearth, and she did not watch his face because she had no right to watch his face at this particular moment, and also because she was not certain she trusted her own expression if she did. When he set it down, his hands were steady. She had expected that, and been right to. "How long have you known?" he asked. 3 weeks. "Did she know you would find it?" Cecily considered the question with the care it deserved, because it was the right question, and it had been sitting in her since November waiting for someone to ask it. "I believe she placed it where I would find it, yes. Whether she intended me to hold it or to act on it, I cannot say. She did not speak of it. She was beyond speaking of things directly. Toward the end. A silence that was not uncomfortable, but that held a great deal. Why did you not burn it? She looked at him then. He was watching her with the gray eyes and the careful stillness, and there was nothing in the question that was accusation. It was genuine, and underneath the genuine was something she recognized as a man who had been wondering whether he would have burned it, and did not entirely know the answer. Because it is yours, she said. It concerns what was done to you. I had no right to make that determination. The stillness held for a moment. Then he exhaled, very slightly, the sound so small she might have imagined it, and she understood from the quality of that breath that he had been carrying something heavier than she had known, and that the letter, whatever it cost him, had also lifted a portion of it. I believed, he said, his voice quiet, the words placed in the air with deliberate care, that I had made her unhappy. He paused. I found her crying once, in the blue sitting room at Warfield. She looked up and saw me in the doorway and said nothing. And I said nothing. And I went away. I had believed since that morning that the tears were mine to account for, that some coldness in me had produced them, some failure I could name if I looked long enough. He stopped. I spent some years looking. Cecily said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not diminish the moment or intrude upon a man doing the work of understanding something that had cost him considerably. After a time he said, Ashworth stands to inherit a considerable trust if the Duchess's marriage is deemed valid. He will not allow this letter to go undisputed. I know. He will come at you directly. I suspected as much. You are not alarmed. It was not quite a question. She thought about it honestly. I am a companion of 3 years' service, with a small legacy and a borrowed room, she said. Mr. Ashworth has already attempted to convince me that the letter belongs to him. Lady Harriet Vane has already suggested that my opinions are not material. I am reasonably well accustomed to being told that I am not sufficient to whatever the occasion requires. She paused. It has not yet proven accurate. He looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in the gray of his eyes, very slightly, in the way that things shift when a person is seen doing something that recalibrates an existing picture. Sit down, he said, and she realized she had been half risen without noticing. She sat. He said, The solicitor will need to see this. Elliot handled the estate. I will arrange a meeting, and you will need to be present to account for how the letter came into your possession. I will be present. You will need someone to accompany you. I will send my carriage. She looked at him. The offer was not framed as an offer. It was framed as a fact about how the morning would proceed. She understood it as care that did not know its own name yet. Thank you, she said. He rose. He stood for a moment with his hat in his hand, and he looked at the letter on the small table as though calculating whether to leave it with her or take it. Keep it, Cecily said. It is yours. He took it. At the parlor door he stopped, and half turned, and said, in the voice of a man asking a question he had been holding back for the better part of the hour, You said it concerns what was done to me. Not the estate, not the marriage, not the law. What was done to me? Yes. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the pale light of the hall behind him. Miss Marsh, he said quietly. Thank you. He went out. Cecily sat in Mrs. Prewitt's parlor with the small fire and the empty table, and the morning light still coming through the net curtains. And she sat very still for a moment, because she was aware of something she had not precisely been aware of before, which was that she was in danger, of an entirely different kind from the one Ashworth presented, and that it was considerably more difficult to prepare for. The days that followed were not peaceful. Ashworth had not found the letter, but he had found its absence, which was nearly as useful. He knew it existed. He had suspected for some weeks that Cecily held it, and her refusal to hand over the Duchess's personal effects in their entirety had not gone unnoticed. He was a man of considerable social means in London, and he began to use those means with the specific patience of someone who has a good deal to lose. By the second week of March, the rumor had taken shape. The companion had stolen papers from the estate. She had been paid, either by creditors or by enemies of the family. She had been observed more than once in private conversation with the Duke, which no companion in reduced circumstances ought to have sought. The story was not coherent, which was its advantage. since an incoherent rumor requires refutation at every angle, and refutation is exhausting. Lady Harriet Vane, the Duke's maternal aunt, was a woman of 60 with the carriage of a grenadier and the social precision of a surgeon. She had been in Bath through the winter, but returned to London with the season's beginning. And she had returned, it appeared, to a situation she found intolerable. On the morning of the 14th of March, she received Cecily at Vane House without having invited her, which was accomplished by sending a carriage to Clarges Street, with a note that read, "We must speak," and a footman whose expression communicated that "we must speak" was not an opening offer. Cecily went. Lady Harriet's drawing room was arranged for displeasure, the best chair occupied by the lady herself, the chairs available to guests situated slightly lower and slightly farther from the fire. It was a room that had been making its points since the previous century, and had made them with great success. "My nephew," Lady Harriet said, before Cecily had fully taken her seat, "has been seen calling upon you privately on 3 separate occasions. That number will not increase. You were the companion to his wife, which is to say you occupied a position that required discretion and produced familiarity. That familiarity is now over, and any papers or effects of the late Duchess currently in your keeping will be surrendered immediately to Mr. Elliot, who acts for the estate." Cecily said, "The papers are not in my keeping. They have been given to the Duke." A pause. "Given to Warfield directly?" "Yes." The pause that followed was different in quality. Cecily watched Lady Harriet recalculate and said nothing to assist her. "You had no right to make a determination of what should and should not be handed to Mr. Ashworth," Lady Harriet said at last. "You were a servant in that house, nothing more than the companion." There it was, said cleanly, in a tone that did not expect argument. Cecily said, "The papers were placed in my care by the Duchess. The Duchess was my employer. I made my determination according to what I believed her wishes to be." "You were a servant?" Lady Harriet said again, with the same flat authority. "The companion's opinions about what the Duchess wished are not material." Cecily rose. "Then I will leave you to pursue the matter with the Duke, your ladyship, since it is now in his hands." She paused. "If it would be useful, I can convey to him that you called." She was almost to the door when Lady Harriet spoke behind her. "Ashworth intends to bring it before the solicitors. That you took the letter, not that you found it. There is a difference in law. And he will make use of it." Cecily stopped. "You should know," Lady Harriet continued, "what is coming for you." Whether it was a warning or a threat, Cecily could not determine. She thanked the older woman in a voice that gave nothing away, and went out into the March cold, and stood for a moment on the pavement with her hands clasped at her waist, and the specific effort of composure arranged in her face like a mask she had learned to fit correctly. He had told her Ashworth would come at her. He had not been wrong. The following Sunday brought the kind of clear, cold morning that London offers perhaps twice in a season, and it brought with it an invitation to a musical entertainment at Mrs. Whitmore's house in Cavendish Square, delivered to Cecily by way of Mrs. Prewitt, who pressed it into her hands with the warmth of a woman who understands that isolation is its own kind of injury. Cecily went because Mrs. Prewitt asked her to, and because she had learned, in the weeks since November, that pride is a luxury and staying at home is not safety. She did not expect it to be the occasion that Ashworth had chosen. The room held perhaps 40 people, arranged around a pianoforte and 3 chairs for the string trio that would perform after the refreshments. Cecily stood near the window with a glass of ratafia she did not intend to drink and watched the room move around her with the particular attention of a woman who has learned to notice where the exits are. Mr. Ashworth arrived at 3:30. He arrived with Lady Harriet on his arm, which told Cecily that the afternoon had been arranged, and not carelessly. He moved through the company with the measured ease of a man who has prepared his remarks and knows his audience, and within 10 minutes he had drawn a small circle of interested listeners, and was speaking, in a voice just loud enough to carry, of the regrettable situation of a young woman whose reduced circumstances had apparently led her to take liberties with a deceased woman's private correspondence. He did not name her. He did not need to. The room turned slowly, as rooms do, in the direction of what is being implied. Cecily set down her ratafia. Lady Harriet said, to the circle and to the room, the companion, of course, had access that none of us could have anticipated would be so thoroughly misused. The companion. The word was clean and quiet, and it carried the weight of everything Cecily had been reduced to for the better part of the autumn, and here was its third use, in this room, in this company, with these faces turned at the edge of her vision to see how she would bear it. She did not look down. She did not cross the room. She stood with her hands at her sides and her chin level and waited because she had nowhere else to go. She did not hear him come in. She heard the quality of the room change in the way she had heard it change in Mrs. Prewitt's drawing room the first morning, and she turned her head, and Dominic Cavendish, Duke of Warfield, was crossing the floor. He was not walking quickly. He was walking the way a man walks when he has made a decision, and the decision is irrevocable, which is to say he was walking with the unhurried certainty of someone who has accounted for every consequence and found them all acceptable. 3 strides brought him to the edge of the circle. The circle parted. Lady Harriet's fan stilled. Ashworth's expression did something complicated and then arranged itself back to readiness. He did not look at Ashworth. He looked at Cecily. "Miss Marsh," he said. His voice was level. "Forgive me for arriving late." Cecily felt her heart beat in her throat. She said, "Your Grace," and held his gaze and did not look at the room. He turned then to the circle and to the room beyond it, and he said, in the same level tone, without inflection and without theater, "Cecily Marsh holds that letter at my request, and I stand by every word in it." 12 words. The room was entirely silent. Ashworth said, "Your Grace, I must object to the characterization of Miss Marsh's conduct. The facts of the matter are not as she has represented them. The facts," the Duke said, "are known to my solicitor, who is in possession of the original correspondence, and whose findings I expect by the end of the week. I am prepared to discuss them with you in that setting." A pause. His voice did not change. "Not this one." Ashworth looked at him for a long moment. The room looked at Ashworth. Lady Harriet's fan had not moved. It was Mr. Elliot who confirmed it. When he arrived at Warfield House on the morning of the 18th, and laid the documents on the library table and said, in the dry, particular voice of a man who has seen a great deal of human complication and retained his composure through all of it, that the marriage between Dominic James Cavendish and Helena Ann Ashworth was null in law, and had been since the date of its performance, and that the estate and the title were unaffected, and that Mr. Gerald Ashworth's claim on the trust he had anticipated was without basis. Cecily was present for this, because the Duke had asked her to be. She sat in the library chair closest to the door, and kept her hands in her lap, and watched the Duke's face as Elliot spoke. And what she saw there was not triumph, and was not relief exactly. It was the slow release of a thing carried for too long, the particular stillness of a man who has been given back a version of his own history that he can live inside. He thanked Elliot. He thanked him briefly and without ceremony, and Elliot nodded and gathered his papers and went out. And the library was quiet for a moment, with only the fire and the sound of a house settling around them. The Duke sat at the table for a moment without speaking. Cecily rose and moved toward the door, because the moment was not hers, and she was already considering where she had left her coat. Cecily. She stopped. He had used her given name twice before. The first time she had not been certain she had heard it. The second time she had heard it clearly, and had filed it carefully in the category of things she was not permitted to examine. She turned. He was standing now, and he was looking at her in a way she had not seen from him before, the gray eyes entirely open. "I have been," he said, "attempting to find the correct manner in which to say something to you for approximately 3 weeks." Cecily waited. "I have failed to find it," he said. "I will say it anyway." He paused. "In the lane behind the market, I watched you give a 16-year-old housemaid back her wages, at some cost to your own standing with Ashworth, because it was the right thing to do." He paused again. "I have not been able to think clearly about the matter of the letter, or the matter of Ashworth, or a great many other matters, because everything I have observed of you since the first morning makes clear thinking difficult." The fire settled. "I am a man in a complicated situation," the Duke said. "I was a husband, it appears, only in my own belief. I have a house that does not feel like a home. I have been cold for a long time, and I did not know until recently that the coldness was not my natural condition, but rather the shape grief takes when a man does not know he is grieving." He stepped once toward her. Just once. She was aware of the distance between them with the whole of her body, the specific awareness that has nothing to do with decision and everything to do with what the body knows before the mind grants it permission. "I am not in a position to ask you anything today," he said. "The situation is not settled, and the law has only just spoken. I want you to know that I am asking, nevertheless. That there is an asking in me. That if, when the dust of this has settled, and the season has turned, and everything is properly accounted for, you are willing to hear it." He stopped. His jaw was set, but his eyes were not. "You would not be required to answer now." Cecily looked at him. She had been told, over the course of 3 years and 3 weeks and 1 winter, that it asked a great deal of her, exactly who she was by the world's accounting. The companion? A reduced circumstance, a useful thing. She had not argued, because arguing was not the currency of her situation. She had simply continued to act from what she knew was true, and she had waited, with no expectation of being seen, because expecting to be seen had begun to feel like a form of self-cruelty she could not afford. She said, "I would be willing to hear it." Something moved across his face. She thought, watching it, that she was perhaps the first person in a very long time who had answered him without calculation. "Good," he said. His voice was quiet. "Then we will wait." He held out his hand. Not as a gesture of ceremony, not as a handshake of transaction, but as a man holds his hand out to a person he intends to stand beside. She took it. His fingers were warm around hers, even through the gloves. They stood there a moment in the library that was not yet her home, in the house that still held the shape of its old unhappiness, and outside the high windows the March light was beginning to angle toward afternoon. Spring came slowly that year, but it came. The ash trees on the Warfield estate in Wiltshire put out their first leaves in early April, and by the time the season had turned toward its quieter stretch, Mr. Elliot had completed his reports and delivered them to the parties concerned, and Mr. Ashworth had retired to his property in Shropshire with the specific haste of a man who has calculated his losses and found wisdom in retreat. Lady Harriet came to Warfield House in Grosvenor Square in the 2nd week of April, and she sat in the upright chair by the window and looked at Cecily for a long time across the space of the morning room. And then she said, You will have been a companion. You will need to learn to be something else." "I know," Cecily said. Lady Harriet considered this. Then, with the particular economy of a woman who does not repeat herself, "You have very good posture." It was, Cecily understood, as much as was on offer, and she received it accordingly. The engagement was announced in May. It was announced in the papers and by way of Mrs. Prewitt, who received the news in her kitchen over tea and pressed both of Cecily's hands and said absolutely nothing at all, which was the exact right response. Mrs. Prewitt had given Cecily shelter and time and the company of a woman who did not require her to be anything other than what she was, and Cecily owed her more than she could name. The wedding was a quiet one, by the standards of the peerage. A small party. The Warfield Estate Chapel, the ash trees now fully leafed, the light coming through the stone windows in the long horizontal rays of a late May morning. There were perhaps 30 guests, which was 30 more than Cecily had expected when she was sitting above Mrs. Prewitt's kitchen in a lavender gown, holding a letter and trying to find the right hand to put it in. On the evening before the ceremony, in the library at Warfield, the Duke fed Helena's letter to the fire. He did it without ceremony. He held it for a moment, the folded paper with its red wax seal, and then he placed it among the coals, and they watched it take and rise and diminish to nothing. And the library was warm and quiet around them. "She was not happy," he said. Not as an accusation. As a fact he had finally made his peace with. "No," Cecily said. "But I think, at the end, she was sorry." He considered this. Then he said very quietly, "That will do." She put her hand over his on the arm of the chair, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and outside the library windows the Wiltshire countryside was settling into the blue of a late May evening, the hills folding themselves into the dark, the light in the west holding on a little longer than seemed possible. The fire held the last of the letter's ash. It had confessed a great deal in the end, a deception, a grief. A man left carrying a wound he had not been given the truth to name, and a woman who had placed it in the path of the one person she trusted to know what to do with the truth, even when the truth was not what anyone had expected. Cecily sat with her husband in the warm library and listened to the house settle around them, and outside the windows the first stars were beginning. She had not expected to be here. She was here. If Cecily's story has stayed with you this evening, leave a thought in the comments below. There is something in the telling of it that asks to be answered. The letter was gone. The library remained. The light in the windows held a little longer than it needed to, and then gave way to the good dark, and the fire burned down to its embers, and the Duke of Warfield did not let go of her hand.